Hey everybody, it's Jeff. I am so excited to bring this particular conversation to you today. For those of you who know my work around grounded spirituality and my deconstructing of the so-called non-duality movement, patriarchal spirituality, the New Cage movement, a journey that in many ways began for me around the time that I was hanging out with Bhagavan Das and Ram Dass and Sean Corn and making my film Carmageddon. If you're familiar with that sort of trajectory, some part of my work, then you know that it's been hard for me to find people who are out there in the teaching community in particular, and those who have followed and believed in ungrounded frameworks and perspectives. It's been difficult for me to find people who really, really understand what I'm talking about and who are really preparing themselves to bring the new methodology, a more embodied, fleshy, heart centered, feeling based, horizontal rather than vertical, grounded spirituality. So, not so long ago, I got some emails from somebody named Jessica Nathanson, who had been part of some of these communities and who has now come to realize how deadly dangerous they really are. Um, and we talk about that in this conversation. I bring her story to you for your consideration. And it's a real delight. It really is to have had this opportunity. So let me just tell you quickly a bit about Jessica. After self-negating spirituality encouraged her to sacrifice too much of her precious humanity, Jessica Nathanson passionately is deconstructing the status quo of either or non-duality and the tragically flawed no self, no suffering movement that is damaging so many hearts, minds, and souls in our world. She's building an online support community, Collective Soul Revival, for others who are recovering from movements like Neo-Advaita, which I call the avoidant movement, and journeying, those who are ready to journey from self-abandonment to self-compassion and the glorious both and of celebrating all dimensions of our sacred humanity. In my words, presence as a whole being experience. This for me is the real spirituality and the direction we must go. So just listen to a little bit of Trevor Hall, his song Arrows from the perfectly, appropriately titled The Fruitful Darkness, and then have a listen. Jessica, get into it. And it's really, really, I think, a really important conversation. I'm so delighted to bring your voice to the world. Hey, Jessica. Good to be with you today.
Hi, it's great to be with you also.
Yeah, we have lots to talk about. Let me just read a quick, well, not so quick quote from Grounded Spirituality that might sort of contextualize some of the non duality kind of monkey business we're going to talk about today. So here's the quote. This is part of a dialogue I have in the book with a character named, semi fictitious character named Michael. So I say to him, it seems you bought into the ego bashing that is intrinsic to the transcendence bypass movement. It's ironic because what motivates the quest for non duality is often the unresolved elements themselves. Denying the ego is egoic. Its denial is often motivated by the unhealthy aspects of ego itself. The diminishment of the emotional body is motivated by the unhealed emotional body. The suggestion that everything is an illusion is motivated by a fear of reality. And the belief that simply witnessing the pain body nullifies it is motivated by the pain body run amok. Witnessing our pain doesn't dissipate it, it strengthens it. If you want to dissipate your pain, get inside it and work it through until it's thoroughly mended. And when it's truly healed, it will both create a richer, fuller life and reveal its essential nature as grist for the soul mill itself, the granules of glory that grow us closer to the God self. How can we evolve without this fodder for our expansion, the soil of our lived in experience? You have bought into a kind of nihilistic worldview that desecrates everything that nourishes and grows us forward. How can you escape into a full life while leaving the self in your dust. Ironically, in your flight from those characteristics, you merely concretize their significance, close quote. So you connected with me as someone who I'm now understanding to be, and I certainly relate to this, kind of an investigative journalist with respect to what I broadly call patriarchal spirituality, and what others call non-duality, and the Advaita movement. I call it the avoid movement. I mean, there's all kinds of terms for this, but because you're getting out there now and you're telling your story of what you realized about that movement in the heart of kind of rejecting the notion of realization that they were trumpeting. Um, so, give us a sense of how you entered into that way of being and that exploration. And then let's just talk about some of the things that you've realized.
Sounds great. And that was a really poignant quote that you read that was nice because I think it brought up a little bit of a emotionality for me, which is good because it's been about 5, almost 6 years now since I came out of my Neo-Advaita kind of haze. And there was a very long period of intense grief and emotional torment. But the good thing is that over time, I've kind of moved through that. So now I'm able to go back into it to really, like you said, investigate kind of what's going on there and help
Mm-hmm.
other people that are really trapped in it.
Mm-hmm.
It's been what I've been spending a lot of time on lately.
And
Because
how might you define the Neo-Advaita movement? I mean, what is that? Just for people who don't know what we're talking about, before we
yeah,
deconstruct it.
it's good to do that. And I personally, for me, I equate Neo-Advaita with modern contemporary self-negating non-duality. And I think specifically the instantaneous enlightenment, where you hear sort of like the direct path, where there's no real long preparatory path. It's sort of these different direct paths within Eastern traditions that have been decontextualized and brought to the West as an instant enlightenment sort of packaging.
Got you. And so what is it that, before we get into your actual experience, what is it within your psyche or your psycho-emotional roots do you feel drew you in that direction?
Yeah, I love your questions. I would say that it's certainly my hereditarily, that's not a word, let's just say hereditary, what I inherited, which was a long lineage of an existential sort of angst or sort of melancholy and even at times depression. So there's that. And I would also say just this real kind of curiosity and being sort of drawn towards deep exploration of the mystery of life.
And so what was your first sort of stepping into this particular exploration?
Well, it's funny because I had pulled this out recently, which was my
Oh, Michael Singer's
yeah,
ridiculous book,
The
but
Untethered
yes.
Soul, which has touched many lives in good and bad ways.
Mm-hmm.
I've been going back through it, and it's funny because I used to give this book to everyone,
Hmm.
and I truly believed that it was incredible for everyone. But when I started reading it again a year ago, I couldn't get past the first 10 pages because I was appalled by what I was reading. Anyway, so I read that when I was 25. I was very lost. I was sort of in this existential conundrums and feeling like I couldn't be present in life and, neurotic, ruminating, thinking. And I picked up this book and it seemed to really have the answers. It was kind of the beginning of feeling like I'd been like let in on that big secret that, he was kind of a whistleblower on personal reality. And this sort of beginning of the beginning of the end of me, if you will. But it was this idea that you're not your thoughts. It started kind of in a slow way, but you're not your thoughts. And the reason why you suffer is solely because of your your thinking and your desire for things to ever be different than what they are, and your preferences and ambitions and all of that. And that like,
Men love blaming the mind, don't they? They love to blame the mind for all their problems, so they don't have to deal with the unresolved emotional material that sources the chatter of the mind.
yeah, and women do it too, but it's
Mm,
certainly that a lot of women have been influenced by these men, because there
mm,
really
mm,
aren't that many. There's several female teachers now, but they've all been disciples or learned from men, you know.
mm,
These traditions where I learned a new word recently, which was androcentric,
mm.
that all these enlightenment traditions were, you know, they were fully crafted by a male perspective.
That's for sure. So you started with the singer inviting you in the direction of seeing an impersonal experience as reality. This is sort of high comedy as far as I'm concerned. But and then what?
And then enter Meister Eckhart. um, Eckhart Tolle. So the power,
Also known as his real name is Ulrich. I just want to state that
that's
the master of form, allegedly of formlessness, was so affixed to form that he had an egoic need to change his name to Eckhart.
of
But yes,
course.
continue.
And the power of now. And I was thinking the other day, would anyone have picked it up if it was called the power of self-annihilation, which
Mhm.
highly doubt. It was very smartly sort of packaged as just a way to be present in self-help. So I say the beginning of the industry of self-destruction disguised as self-development.
Right.
So we have ego death in the self-help section of Barnes and Noble. But back to the story. So I read Eckhart, The Power of Now, and I'm utterly blown away, like a lot of people are when they read it. And it really was the entry of that, what is the sort of the one problem, one solution formula
Mhm.
of no self, no suffering.
Right.
So
So you're go to bed suicidal. You have some kind of an experience in the night, and you wake up in the morning in a state of what he calls enlightenment. Sit happily, as he described, on park benches for 2 years in a state of persistent and perpetual bliss. Psychologists call that dissociation. Patriarchal spirituality calls that awakening.
yeah, how do you think he survived on that bench? Do you think people
Well,
brought
I mean, I believe I may be mistaken, but I think he was living in Canada. I don't know if he had a job or if he was on welfare. I mean, if you're on welfare and it can cover your bills, that'd be kind of blissful for a certain brief period of time for some of us, I think. And I don't know. I mean, I think the way he describes it is, I mean, to me, when I read the intro to The Power of Self-Avoidance, which I've called it for years, I just didn't buy it. I don't believe trauma is resolved overnight. I think he found a seam that allowed him to stay alive in a suicidal consciousness. And if there's nothing wrong with going out into the world and teaching that the seam that you found is a way for people to stay alive until they're ready to drop back into their bodies. And but for me, the giveaway with Tolle, I used to call him Dead Heart Tolle. The giveaway for me was that I couldn't feel any aliveness coming off of him. There was I would fall asleep when he talked, and I thought this is a very strange version of awakening or aliveness when the body seems to be completely dead, and all I hear is a really powerhouse mind bashing the mind, but yet living inside of the mind. It's the great irony of patriarchal spirituality. They blame the mind and then they go meditatively into the mind in order to tame the mind. They don't want to drop down into the feelings or
yeah,
the body because we know what happens. Then they become suicidal again. So I don't know how it worked. I mean, I think that he became famous. Oprah, who I think has a bypassing tendency, was drawn to this for her own reasons. It got sold all over the world, and then now it's getting deconstructed because reality is forcing all of us to ground in our bodies and realizing that it just doesn't work that way. And you don't call your tender woundedness a pain body like you're talking about a car part. And it all starts to look ridiculous and dissociated. But at that
well,
time, it was like an
cool.
opportunity to see ourselves through a different lens. And
Exactly.
yeah,
Um, it was very you know, a very new radical thing that helped a lot of people. So it
mm-hmm,
is, I think we talked about that before, that I don't think either of us are denying that there are, you know, some good presence pointers in there and things like that. But I say with all of these things that it's a little bit like, and I didn't make this metaphor up, but it's a bit of like a nectar laced with poison. And that's kind of what you drink with a lot of these people.
Yeah, I mean, it's fine. I agree with you. I mean, I think that when you call it enlightenment, we have a problem.
Yes.
But when you say I'm a really fucked up guy and I absolutely haven't resolved tons of stuff, but I found some sort of meditative or witnessing oriented techniques that have helped me to get a bit of distance and perspective on my stuff, then I don't have a problem with that. But when you frame that dead energy as something enlightened, I don't think at the end of the day you're actually helping anybody. I think that for real serious trauma survivors, you're leading them farther away from the field of selfhood where the healing has to occur. And I've had many people write me before killing themselves and people who knew people who had. And quite often they read these kinds of books and it led in a horrific direction because they became dissociated and were convinced that nothing was real, nothing they felt, none
Yes.
of their trauma, none of their woundedness. We'll talk about your experience with that. And that's what got me going. I thought, well, this isn't really helpful. It's helpful for a relatively intact person to pull up and out of the neurotic Western mind or something and get perspective. But hardcore trauma survivors should really not have anything to do with these kinds of teachings.
No, they shouldn't. And I also don't, like you said, I don't, I think it harms at this point. I think it may harm more people than it helps to
Yes.
have these one problem, one solution things that turn you against yourself and your mind. But it helped me immensely with thinking. I mean, the problem is that it took me from an overactive mind to a vacuous mind at a certain point
Mm,
where it wasn't, none of these teachings are about bringing anything into balance.
mm,
I think that when you see it from that perspective, that it's radical and balanced, just swinging things from one extreme to the other to see
mm.
how unhealthy that is.
Well
And
said.
unnecessary. It's just not necessary to do that. But yeah, I mean, the thing that his book started doing, and it didn't really get super hardcore until I got into like Life Without a Center with Jeff Foster, and
Oh
then
God. Yeah.
End of Your World. And I yeah, so it sort of begins that sort of Orwellian truth inversion, right? Where it's the true self, you're a false self. So your problem is a case of a mistaken identity. And there's
Yeah.
an imposter inside of you, and that's you,
Who
essentially.
who thinks her name is Jessica Nathanson? How dare you?
Yeah, and that thinks that they're a person. You think you exist as an individual, and that's why you suffer. And you're also pathological. So one of the things I picked up from Eckhart Tolle's book that's really frightening is that it's this pathologization. Is that a word? Pathology. Okay, you know what I'm saying. Making everyone into having a pathology merely because they think that they're a person. So in a way, it's pathologizing humanity.
Well, and that's and ironically calling it the new Earth, but I used to call it the new Mars because there's no honoring of the human experience in any of this, or lineage, or story, or booby, or ancestry, or gefilte fish. None of it, any of it, all of it. It's a good story for as long as it lasts, but it doesn't last for very
Not
long.
even really a good one, because it would be an unpopulated Earth at that point. And I think it's actually quite ominous when you look at a title like The End of Your World by Adyashanti to hear that it's really an apocalypse. And it's
Mm-hmm.
not being said that it's anything other than that. But
Mm.
anyway, so yeah, so then you kind of get into this false ultimatum, which is like you can either suffer forever, trapped in this me prison with ignorance and being asleep, or you can commit egocide. And I say it in that way because a lot of the people that I was reading were talking about it in that way. Ego death, destroy, annihilate, eradicate, burn down. It's they, instead of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, these guys actually rip out the bathtub and burn the house down. So um, it's that idea of that kind of divine suicide of die before you die, to realize there's no such thing as death. And I've come back lately to this phrase, and I think it's a good example of the really kind of mysterious and confusing weird inversions of language that is often used, which is only the false can be destroyed. You've probably heard something to that extent. So the idea being, well, don't worry, because all you're going to be there's nothing to lose except for lies. There's nothing to lose except for illusion and delusion. And who doesn't want to rid themselves of delusion? But really that's, if it's something that's temporary, it's not real, which at this point I realize that that's just a complete fallacy. But yeah, so that divine suicide, and for me, somebody who had a terror of mortality, this helped me incredibly. This whole kind of, dissolve the one who is afraid to die, dissolve the one who's suffering, self, no suffering. And it can work temporarily, maybe for some long term, but we know what the sacrifices are to do such a thing. But yeah, I mean, from there on, I went through sort of what I see as kind of like a funnel that people are kind of pushed through on this path. And, thousands of people that you hear from they end up in that addiction phase where they're addicted to these videos. And you'll find it funny that a lot of people find Eckhart Tolle's voice very comforting and soothing. I mean, I thought he was hilarious. I thought he was this hilarious spiritual comedian, which he really is. He had some strange mystique to him. But anyways, it was his voice. It was Alan Watts. It was Adyashanti. It was Rupert Spira. These sort of hypnotizing voices that were helping me stay clean of my addiction to self. Helping me, when I astray back into thinking that I'm real or that problems are really a problem, etc. So who knows how many hours I spent doing that. And all the people that are coming to me now and who are part of a growing support community are trying to kick that addiction, of listening and listening and listening. And just being sort of pummeled with these derealization and depersonalization messages. That really does start to indoctrinate you in a way, and brainwash you. But the next thing that I got to was the life without a center. And I mean, for me at the time, it was like, this was such a holy grail for me. And I really, for a long time, felt really nothing but happy and liberated, and even, feeling more mature because I felt like I didn't need anything outside of me. I now realize, and I think that you probably will appreciate this, is the idea that, people who were neglected growing up or experienced like psychological trauma from caregivers, that really what they're telling you is self-soothing, that you don't need, you don't need anyone else to soothe you when, you could be somebody who was not soothed as a baby or a child, starving for the attunement and affection of another person. And they're telling you that you don't need that. So yes, a double-edged sword. Again, it's great to not be overly dependent on external situations, but radical isolationism is not the solution either. So this next thing that happens is this idea that the reason why you're depressed is because you're trying to hold up a sense of being somebody, and really kind of goading you, just drop that, just unburden yourself of a self. And that also really spoke to me. But really, when you look back to it, I think people are more depressed in terms of holding up a self. I think it's more that a lot of times you're holding up a sense of self that is based on what other people want you to be, and you haven't really created or discovered what feels like an authentic sense of Jessica or Jeff.
Yes.
Or whatever.
Yeah. So let me speak to that for a sec. I think this is the trick of it all. So they show up, and really the way I see almost all of them is that they're all hardcore trauma survivors who don't understand that you can be in the self and have a joyous experience because they haven't had one. So all they know is suffering with the self. So it makes sense they would want to find some sense of sort of placid in equanimity or something, the neutralization of the self, in order to just have a break from their suffering. There's no ecstasy there really, because they call it bliss, but there's no bliss because there's no self to be bliss. But I think Byron Katie's a good example of this. She tells a very similar silly story at the beginning of her main book about being a mess and then waking up and she's not a mess anymore. And what I find interesting is that what they're appealing to often in even just day-to-day people who are not hardcore sufferers is the fact that they haven't found out who they really are, say on a sacred purpose level. In a conditioned world, in a overwhelming survivalistic world where you become what you have to become to put food on the table, most people have never thought about who they are on an authentic level. And that's true. The problem is, the trick is, they're not leading you there. They're leading you further away from that because the further you get away from the self and the experience of embodiment, the further you get away from identifying the true self and the authentic experience of embodiment. So that's the game. We're going to turn around your story, and sometimes it's good. You go, yeah, I could look at it a different way through a non conditioned lens. But if the real goal of that is to take you so far away into this Buddhistic land of nothingness, you've actually not served a higher purpose for anybody on this planet. And now they are miles and miles and far, far, far away from being able to come back down into their bodies and figure out, make distinctions between false self, true self, false path, true path, survivalistic identifications, authentic identifications. You will not find it in no self land. Go there for a while if you need to clear some patterning, but you've got to come back into this beautiful, glorious human story in order to find the story that's right for you.
Right. And that's, of course, the story is such a
Yeah,
massive.
yeah, they love that. They love to bash the story as though every single part of my booby and the soup and the building me and the loving me, all of that is annihilated. She's
Yeah.
annihilated. It's all because she was thinking she loved her grandson Jeffrey was a complete misidentification. She had no idea who she was. She had no idea who I was. So there couldn't possibly be anything genuine about that experience. It's
Yeah.
such a disparaging and discrediting of the beautiful elements of the human story in a quest for the annihilation of every part of it that you end up, well, tell us where you ended up.
Yeah. And I'll just say quickly about the story part is that the sad thing is that they've reduced a human to a story, or a person to a story, when a story is a part of a human. It's not the whole thing. And they're saying that. So,
Hmm.
right. So, and is also, you were saying that's part of the kind of trick or the game, whatever you're going to call it, is that what really gets programmed into you is that the authentic self is nobody. So any type of personal sense of self is immediately inauthentic.
Yeah, the absolute self is the only self there is. There can't
Really,
be a uniquely Jessica Nathanson path or purpose encoded in you in the bones of your being that you're born to live out and bring to the world. All of that is preposterous. All there is this amorphous, non-individuated absolute selfhood state or something.
and it's really
Wow.
heartbreaking because you get the capital S self, the lowercase s self, and the fact that they give that amorphous awareness, or whatever you call it, the name self, really, I think, really fucks with people's heads. And I mean, it makes sense. So yeah, so of course, along this path, there's the dissolution where I experienced, a massive, what I would have called sort of like an ego blowout, of
Mhm.
suddenly it's just boundless kind of open awareness with no sense of self or even being encased within a physical body, and it's radically serene, and there's no perceiver, etc. And I kept wanting to deepen into that, and so these are kind of the days of boundlessness, and you hear that word over and over, the boundless, pristine, immaculate, perfect, infinite awareness. And there's a lot of insights here that were helpful, but
Mhm.
boundlessness became my started to become more of a default. And what I later realized, and this comes back to trauma, is that, what so many people need is not boundlessness. Our problem for so many is not that we have too strong boundaries. So we do often have over defensiveness, but especially trauma survivors, it's, that you need to strengthen a healthy set of boundaries. So that was only being further eroded. And so there was this very slow kind of erosion of personality and
Mhm.
personhood. So I wanted to just get to this point where looking back, there was a real, for some of these people, was a real like language of violence and a sense of violence in this whole sort of waking up thing. And so, I had, and again, when I name names of people, I'm fully aware that there are good aspects of them. But when I got to Adyashanti and the End of Your World, there was a lot of talk of things like, maybe it wasn't that book specifically, but there's one quote that I remember that was like, every moment of transcendence is a mortal blow to the ego. There was, again, all this talk of like burning down and, eradicating, and just, it was just a stage of radical destruction or deconstruction and breaking everything down into its constituent parts. And it, like you said before, sort of like evaporating into dust. But I'm just going to speed up a little bit so we can get more to the present day. And I've told this story a lot and you'll hear it in other conversations, but that kind of slow erosion of personality and that everyone experiences, that goes down these paths and ends up finding, the kind of perils of it, is this loss of motivation, but what it came with was also more access to these like states of radical contentment. But that radical contentment is a demotivating type of contentment because it just feels like there is nothing to do. There's nothing to say. There's nowhere else I need to be. Why go to a concert? Why, go hang out with friends and have conversations with illusory dream characters? That's what it felt like. So yeah, it just got to this point where more and more I became just an emptied out sort of, this is speeding up a bit, but shell of a person. And I'm going to read another Adyashanti quote because I think it is important to see some of these things that we often don't necessarily hear when talking about them, is that without emotional investment in the ego's point of view, what is left of ego but a hollow shell with a little bit of personality mixed in? And looking back, I think, wow, it's just such a foreboding or foreshadowing of what happened and what happens to so many people, is getting to that point where they feel dehumanized, they feel subhuman. I call some people subhuman superheroes, or that's what they feel like to me, or what I felt like to myself at some point. But just realizing that, we've gone from these outgoing, enthusiastic people who thrived on connection and, adventure and things like that in a healthy way, are now sort of, they're not interested in, I get heartbreaking emails from people that are like, I used to love art and I used to love reading and music, and now all kind of just dead to me. I've gotten several emails of people who said they dropped out of school because they were passionate about, X subject, and now it just feels meaningless, or just that they are in such a state of, radical derealization and dissociation that they can't keep up with it. So, loss of a lot of your passions, and just feeling like you've become a zombie. And that did happen to me at one point. For as much as I had become, awakened and ego dissolved, it was just this sort of really scary feeling of like, kind of made a strange deal with the devil. And really what got me in the end to starting to need to get out of it was realizing that I could barely have relationships anymore. I could hardly carry on conversations without being exhausted after the first sentence. And just really that kind of, like I said, that sort of, I had listened to Rupert Spira a lot, and one of my big pointers was kind of like falling back into what is prior to all content. And I'd really kind of been sucked into this background awareness, where it felt like it was very hard for me to come forward into the land of self, and interaction, and to gather myself in from that boundlessness was very hard. And yeah, so relationships, I realized, am I gonna sacrifice having, rich, intimate relationships for the rest of my life? I might be able to do that and just be in like serene, no self land, but started to get to me that like, that might not be what I really want. And then of course, it did spin out into some like harrowing loss of agency, and some real kind of dissociative episodes that were, not healthy and very scary. So I'm going to speed through this part too, but I have to thank Jeff Foster at the same time, because while he was the one that led me into this life without a center, he also had realized over time that he had been part of Neo-Advaita, which he called a loveless cult. And at a retreat of his, I went, and his whole tune had changed to not self-abandonment, but self-befriending and self-compassion. And just the whole thing collapsed right there, that I'd never heard such a concept. And just like, if I had been told that instead of just transcendence, wouldn't I have gone for that? Like, this seems so much,
Depends
so much.
when. Depends when.
Depends when, you're right. But at this point, it was like, I just felt devastated that I had gone down this path of the self eradication, when I could have been on this other more humanistic path. And that's when it was just like rapid fire, seeing all the kind of tragic elements of the no self, no suffering path, and feeling like I had really kind of died in a way, and I was sort of in an afterlife that it was a kind of period of like rebirthing and reauthoring a new sense of self. And yeah, I mean, it took years for me to get through a lot of grief, and a lot of what happened was all my trauma started coming back. I kind of had some people call it Kundalini. I don't relate to it fully as that, but what happened at the moments that I started turning towards myself with self-compassion, that everything I had been pushing away just rushed to the surface, like Pandora's box, and realizing that I had worked through some stuff in therapy during this time, but there was a hell of a lot of it still there. And it was showing me that. And that the path forward was self-compassion and, things like inner child work, a lot of the stuff that you talk about, and really opening my heart to suffering rather than trying to, get rid of it, burning down the one who suffers, which is what a lot of these people say is the sacred purpose of suffering, is to basically, is self-immolation, if you will, which is
Aren't
very
they?
scary.
Aren't they funny people? You know, and this may just be my sort of male perspective or intuition or something, but
Not
when I
accepting.
absolutely, um, so this is coming from not Jeff Brown, just a perspective, and not Jeff Brown says that I would watch them, Eckhart and Jashanti, and even Jack Cornfield, and certainly Jeff Foster, and all of them, and all I saw, apart from the desperately egoic need to be seen as the one while completely bashing, wanting to allegedly dissolve the ego, was anger. They all just seemed such angry men, angry at life, angry at self, angry at feelings, angry at the feminine, angry at the body. I can't remember. I think it was Tole was with, maybe it was Tammy Simon. Um, they were doing some kind of conversation about 9/11. It was just the way he was sort of mocking the people. And I thought, you know, I mean, Eckhart just strikes me as just an absolutely enraged human being. That's just my personal response to him. And I just think all of them are just angry futhermuckers, masquerading as some kind of blissful Captain Bliss characters, but none of them actually ever feel happy to me. It never feels to me like they've achieved anything that feels good or buoyant or light or soft or surrendered or sweet. It just feels like some kind of a 18-hour a day meditation clamoring for pseudo equanimity until their partner shows up and they have an argument and realize how super fucked up they really are. And
Nobody questions their ideology.
yeah, right, absolutely. Well, or just what comes up in the presence of the human experience when you haven't been able to convince everybody around you to go no self. I mean, then you've got a real problem. You're married to a selfer and you're a no selfer, and oh my God, where do we go from
A lot of
there?
divorce happens, I'll tell
Yeah,
you.
yeah, absolutely. But of course, on one half of it, there's really nobody there to divorce. So I don't even know how they go through a legal process as a non-entity, but that's a whole other question.
Sure, not sure how they
So,
go.
so, so now, so in terms of anger, um, where do you sit with your anger, not only in relation to early life experiences, stuff that you pushed away, but do you feel angry? And how are you experiencing anger in relation to what you've now realized about these very dangerous teachings?
Yeah, and this is a hard thing for me because I also realize like anger is something that I've repressed my whole life because I
Mm.
had an angry caregiver who kind of, stifled my own anger, and I learned to see anger as just something awful, because it wasn't healthy, it wasn't expressed in a healthy way. But so I've been through real days of anger and rage because there is a lot of people who are their lives are being completely devastated in unhealthy ways, and people are dying, and that's at the extreme. But when you get emails from hundreds of people in varying states of dysfunction and down maddening rabbit holes of derealization and depersonalization and nihilism and you know isolation, just horrible things. And we're not talking about a handful of people here. It's I would say there could be millions. Who knows? If you think of how many
Oh
millions.
no, I think there were millions,
I mean,
and
we have a large Facebook group, and I'm imagining that you hear stories like this
I've
all.
received thousands and thousands of these
You
emails.
know what this stuff is made of, and it is tragic,
It's
utterly
hard.
tragic.
It's really hardcore, and I think apart from the suicidal ideation that often emerges for trauma survivors who are trapped in these places, it's very obvious that our species is in trouble. Our capacity to live on this planet is questionable. All the rest of that, and for me, with so many people dissociated, not with their boots on the ground, not with their hearts on their sleeves, not finding something purposeful to bring to the world, what are the chances that we're going to be able to actually preserve the species? Um, and there are all many forms of dissociation in our world. I mean, this is we're only talking about one of them, but I think it's one that, because of the way in which spirituality was set up, where nobody was allowed to diss it. I went through years of this in social media, posting stuff when nobody was, and people would come on and just bash the fact that I had critically reviewed spirituality. And these were people who were critically reviewing political world. They were activists. They were all kinds of things. But somehow, the guru had worked this so fucking brilliantly that
Yeah.
spirituality became something that you never critically review. And as a result, people who walk down these roads don't have books to turn to, as an example, don't have other teachings to listen to that will remind them that what they're doing may in fact be dangerous. They can
Yes.
still proceed and they'll make their own choice, but it's important that they have all of these perspectives available to them before they
Yes.
walk down a road that might kill them.
That's right. And yeah, I mean, in terms of anger also, and just some insight into, how much work it's going to take, and takes a lot of people to extricate themselves from this, is that there
Mm-hmm.
really is something that you realize is that you're radically deprogrammed, that everything you think is true is not. And then you're reprogrammed with a new rigid authoritarian ideology that you often don't see is there, especially if you've really gone deep into kind of dissolution of concepts and that type of stuff, that you come out of it. And I just realized I am fucked up on concepts, the absolute and the relative and the big self and the little self and all of this stuff that I know a lot of people that are now calling cult recovery specialists, because I've been learning a lot about cult dynamics and spiritual abuse, and there is a real pattern of the criteria, a lot of the criteria of that.
Of course, absolutely. These teachings are all cultist teachings, on every level. The nature of patriarchal spirituality is cultist. It's designed. There's always a god-jectified guru in these structures. They're always denying the veracity of the ego while taking the one seat as the one who knows. I mean, it's all of this is
Yeah.
cultist, and particularly confusing and dangerous if the culture in is one that has convinced you that the self isn't real. So now you don't have a self to move from, to intuit from, to
It's
react from, to enrage from, to claim this is bullshit once you start to realize you're being
that
fucked with.
that's valid, because with heartbreaking thing with so many people, it's just that constant gaslighting of, well, that's just the ego talking, and you can't, you can't understand this from rationality. So any way that you're basically, barred from being able to break it down rationally, because you've been so kind of shamed and twisted into thinking that this is just beyond logic. So anything that you say or anyone else says is automatically can't touch it. So there's so
It's a
many
total mind fuck. It's just a
it's
complete mind fuck while they're busy bashing and blaming the mind for every single issue that we have. And meanwhile, they're working from within the mind to control the mind while telling you that your mind is the problem.
exactly.
It's so filled with irony. All
It
of
takes a
this
long time
is
to unravel the matrix of it, and it can be really shocking to see the extent of it. But you picked up on something important in terms of the survival of the species and everything that's happened, in the last how many years with, authoritarian powers that be in politics and globalism, and I would even say, like the woke culture.
the pseudo
Just
woke culture.
well, we get back
Yes.
into sleeping, we're going to go down another rabbit hole. But just this real sense lately of, people are not independent thinkers anymore. And,
Yeah.
free thought and free speech is under attack everywhere you look. And then I turn back to what I had been through, and these anti-intellect type of spiritualities are really not going to help us to, resist being programmed by any authoritarian power,
No,
because,
because that's not real.
well, it's eroding it's crippling our thinking. And one
Yeah.
of the things that I've come to is that, yes, a lot of us suffer a lot from overthinking and ruminating, but it's not about getting rid of thinking. It's about healing patterns of thinking, and it's about thinking in healthier ways and thinking more critically. I've come to, this real value of like wise, critical discernment. I'll even say that, I'm become a healthy skeptic, because it's like 99% of the stuff out there in spirituality to me is deceptive, it's dangerous, it's taking people further into the dark than into the light. And so, yeah, in terms of looking at evolution, we really have to turn towards thinking in more evolved ways rather than not thinking or
Yeah.
deadening them.
And living our life with a center, um, so that we can make clear distinctions between what's real
Yeah,
and what isn't. So
that's
we can
spiritual,
spot the
not spiritual.
that's real spirituality. So that we can make the distinction between the tyrant who masquerades as benevolent, which is happening and has always happened. It is certainly happening right now in Canada, and justifies the clamping down on freedom of speech and expression, and
Exactly.
masquerades it behind all kinds of diversionary cliches that will fool people into thinking that they're cared for, when in fact all they want is to be the one globalist leader of all the globalist leaders. I mean, it's becoming more and more obvious to me that, and it's problematic because technology allows them to overwhelm consciousness more than it was already overwhelmed by marketing constructs, and gives them powers and access and data and information to manipulate consciousness. And the real war between a freedom oriented, critical, grounded, centered consciousness and whatever that other thing is, which is the annihilation of the self in a different way, but really the same way. I mean, I realized at some point that for me, Tolle and any politician who was really annihilating the self was the same guy, was the same guy. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
So going forward for you now, so you're beautifully and brilliantly, and I'm I'm so proud of you, even though I mean I've only just met you, but I'm so delighted that I've been doing this stuff for a long time, and I've been calling out many of those people that you mentioned. In fact, every one of them I've called out in different ways, and I seldom find, and people resonate with my work and they agree with parts of it, and it's beautiful, but it's hard to find people out there who are not only deconstructing it, but interested in crafting a new methodology that is a more grounded, reality based, truly consciousness inclusive, self honoring,
Yeah.
distinction making, critically thinking version of spirituality that really begins and maybe perhaps even ends within the body itself, rather than in the float away from it. So I'm just kudos to you for doing this. It gives me hope for humanity. People who like me who write these things, and we have followings, and it's wonderful to be supported. But we always know that there are millions of other people that need to hear this message, and we can't get it to them because the drumbeat of dissociation is so loud and so powerful, and so coercive on many different levels, and so insincere, and therefore more effective as a marketing construct.
Yeah.
So, apart from deconstructing it, and in the deconstructing of it, and we need decades of that. Don't let anyone ever tell you enough is enough of that. In terms of the building of something different, and soon, where are you with that?
Yeah, it's a great question because I am very much, I go back and forth between those two things, the deconstruction and the reconstruction.
Reconstruction, right?
But I mean, and I think what I have turned towards, it's a harder sell than, the dissociation, or in a lot of ways, but it's really that, suffering can serve the purpose of breaking our hearts open to our suffering, to our trauma, open to other people, to empathy, to compassion, and really a sense of real camaraderie and unity and interconnection with the human race and with the human condition, really being a member of a human family, if you will. And so I think that a big thing for me is taking the transcendent down into the if you're going to call it the personal or the immanent or whatever, but healing that split of spirit versus matter, which is extremely dual, and what's happening in what's being considered non-dual. So healing that split, and then rather than going to this kind of oneness only, no separateness, is really widening our perspective, which is taking in the whole, but then to act and engage in the world with that wider angle view, that I've thought of a little bit as kind of like a world centric view. And I think that we need that. And I also think really that really encouraging us to see ourselves in our small existence is actually extremely significant.
Yes.
And for each person, that your individuality is you are special. This whole thing of trying to be special or thinking you're special is a problem and self-centered, is that everyone's special because they exist. And
Yeah.
really, for me, I think that heart of spirituality is wonder and awe, and is being able to, for me, it's gone, and I would like to suggest for others, like rather than seeking this sort of like spiritual perfection or perfectionism, is like preciousness. It's like returning to having the eyes to see the immense miracle of you and of me. And there's so much suffering, but if we open our heart to it and help allow that to deepen our interwovenness, that can really be what serves as a foundation. And then of course this both and this either or thinking in every sphere of the world, really we have to move to both and thinking. And yeah, in terms of evolution, I think it's much more about that. I've said the uni-dual, which I get from Tim Freak, is being individuals who are also unified with one another. And so, yeah, I can say it's been a little bit of I could say a path from self-abandonment to self-compassion. Sorry, I'm picking up my cat. Oh, okay, there we go. And definitely lots of cats and animals. But yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I do want to say to people that are in these paths that say that in order to have oneness you have to disappear, is that no, we get to be a part of that oneness, and that we are, yeah, just that everything is so significant because it's here and it's real. And you've said enrealment, and I had a kind of new understanding of that, and you had said it, and it's really, you had said something like being all that you are, or all that we are.
Yeah, and being presence as a whole being experience. I mean,
Exactly.
that's really what we're talking about.
Right.
Every aspect of this experience welcomed. at the table, and the honoring, the absolute honoring of the uniqueness of your particular path and purpose and orientation in this lifetime, and
Wholeness.
absolutely distinguishing all of that from the malconditioning and the survivalistic adaptations and disguises that have oriented our consciousness, but again, not moving away from the self, learning how to, I mean, I think it would be an interesting question if we could get this oneness right. I mean, oneness like me, one, me, you, one. If we could just get that right, and then ask the question, how does this interface with the oneness? I would be interested to see how all of this looks from that perspective, but we keep jumping out of the healing and integrating and becoming present for the oneness, the Jeffness, the Jessica-ness. We leave it so quickly because of the pain and the discomfort and the reasons to dissociate, that I don't think we have any idea what we're talking about when we're talking about inclusivity or non-duality of consciousness, because we're not inclusive or even non-dual or unified within the self itself. And
Yeah.
my work really is to convey to people that that's where we're at as a species, that's where we need to stay. And then when we get that right, let's start talking about whether or not we even have any interest in or have a totally different perspective on this whole question of something called non-duality or transcendence. Like we're birds may all just seem like the dumbest and most ridiculous thing that was really birthed in the discomforts of the human experience. And now that we're more comfortable in our bodies, maybe we don't even have any interest in
Yeah.
that
And you
at all.
said inclusivity, and that's another piece of it is wholeness. And wholeness means including everything. There was in
Right.
this non-whole world that wholeness could be achieved by rejecting something.
Well, how
Wholeness
can
was
they call it non-duality? It's preposterous if they bash the body, the ego, personhood, the selfhood, the
yeah,
feelings, the story,
yeah,
everything human has been removed from the non-dual field. I think that's just called the celebration of automatism or the becoming of a robot, and that's not really any kind of a non-duality that's going to serve
yeah.
us.
Yeah, but and wholeness means embracing a lot of shit that we don't want to embrace, but it's
Yeah,
worth it. It really is.
I don't think we have a choice at this
Yeah.
stage of the game. So, so thank you for your courage, for rebraving yourself in this lifetime, and I look forward to reconnecting when you reach the next stage of whatever this is that's beautifully happening inside of you.
Well, I deeply appreciate having discovered you and being a part of this. And if I can just say that for anyone who's listening who is seeking support with going through any of this, that we'll put hopefully somewhere, and if there's a description somewhere,
Yeah,
contact, because I am starting an online community soon for people who are recovering from all of this and moving
great.
forward. Okay.
So we'll have those links. That's perfect.
Thank
Thank
you.
thank you, Jessica.
Bye.